the Spanish airline that almost conquered the skies. Air Europa's rise and fall. In 1986, when most of Europe's skies were still dominated by bloated state-owned carriers, a small family business in Mallorca decided to challenge the established order. Air Europa emerged from the Hidalgo family's tourism empire, initially flying charter routes to feed their hotel business. But what started as a modest operation to transport holidaymakers to the Balearic Islands would grow into Spain's second-largest airline, directly challenging the mighty Iberia and pioneering routes across the Atlantic to Latin America. For 3 decades, Air Europa proved that a private carrier could not only survive but thrive against government-backed competitors, building a network that stretched from Madrid to Montevideo, from Barcelona to Buenos Aires. Yet despite its remarkable success in carving out a niche in one of aviation's most competitive markets, Air Europa's story would ultimately become a cautionary tale about the limits of family-owned businesses in an industry increasingly dominated by massive airline conglomerates. The seeds of Air Europa were planted in the tourism boom of 1970s Spain, when Juan José Hidalgo Acera transformed a small travel agency into the Globalia Group, a tourism conglomerate that would eventually encompass hotels, ground handling services, and travel retail operations. Hidalgo understood better than most that controlling the entire tourism value chain was essential for profitability, and an airline was the missing piece of his puzzle. When Spain began deregulating its aviation market in the mid-1980s, Hidalgo seized the opportunity to launch Air Europa with just 2 leased Boeing 737-300 aircraft. The airline's initial fleet was modest, but its ambitions were enormous from day one. Air Europa commenced operations on November 21, 1986, with domestic flights connecting Madrid to Palma de Mallorca, Tenerife, and Las Palmas, routes that perfectly complemented the Hidalgo family's hotel properties. The timing was impeccable, as Spain was experiencing unprecedented tourism growth ahead of hosting the 1992 Olympics in Barcelona and Expo 92 in Seville, events that would put Spanish aviation on the global map. What set Air Europa apart from other startup carriers was its founder's deep understanding of the Spanish tourism market and his willingness to invest in long-term growth rather than quick profits. While Iberia focused on maintaining its status as a full-service flag carrier with an extensive European network, Air Europa identified 2 underserved market segments that would define its success: leisure travelers heading to Spain's holiday destinations and the growing demand for flights between Spain and Latin America. The Latin American strategy was particularly brilliant, as Spain's historical and cultural ties to the region created natural demand that Iberia couldn't fully satisfy with its limited fleet and bureaucratic approach to route development. By 1988, Air Europa had launched its first international route to Rome, followed quickly by flights to London and Paris. The airline's fleet grew rapidly, adding Boeing 757s for longer routes and maintaining its 737s for domestic and short-haul European services. The carrier's punctuality rates consistently exceeded those of Iberia, while its cost structure allowed for competitive pricing that appealed to both leisure and business travelers seeking alternatives to the national carrier. The 1990s marked Air Europa's transformation from a domestic carrier to a serious international competitor, with the airline's expansion into Latin America becoming its defining characteristic. In 1992, the same year Spain showcased itself to the world through the Olympics and Expo, Air Europa launched flights to Caracas, Venezuela, marking its entry into the transatlantic market that would become its crown jewel. The route was an immediate success, leading to rapid expansion across Latin America with destinations including Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, Lima, Bogotá, and Mexico City. Air Europa's Latin American network eventually grew to include over 20 destinations, making it one of Europe's largest carriers to the region. The airline's success in Latin America wasn't accidental. It was built on understanding that Spanish and Latin American passengers wanted more than just transportation between continents. Air Europa positioned itself as a cultural bridge, hiring Spanish-speaking crews, offering Latin American cuisine, and scheduling flights to optimize connections for both business and family travel. The carrier also benefited from Spain's economic boom in the 1990s and 2000s as Spanish companies invested heavily in Latin America following privatization programs across the region, creating sustained demand for business travel. Air Europa's fleet strategy during this period demonstrated the Hidalgo family's commitment to competing with major carriers on equal terms. The airline began retiring its older 737s in favor of more modern aircraft, including the Boeing 737-800 for European routes and the Airbus A330 for long-haul services to Latin America and eventually North America. By the early 2000s, Air Europa operated one of Europe's youngest fleets, with an average aircraft age of just 5 years compared to Iberia's aging collection of aircraft that dated back decades. The airline's livery, featuring a distinctive blue and white design with the European Union stars prominently displayed, reinforced its positioning as a modern, European alternative to traditional flag carriers. Air Europa also invested heavily in cabin improvements, introducing lie-flat seats in business class on long-haul flights and maintaining higher seat pitch than many competitors in economy class. The airline's on-time performance consistently ranked among Europe's best, a crucial advantage over Iberia, which suffered from chronic delays due to outdated infrastructure and labor disputes. These operational improvements helped Air Europa win contracts with major tour operators and establish itself as the preferred carrier for Spanish corporations doing business in Latin America. The 2000s brought both unprecedented growth and the first signs of the challenges that would eventually overwhelm Air Europa's family-owned business model. The airline expanded beyond its Spanish base with operations in France and Italy, while adding new long-haul destinations including New York, Miami, and several Caribbean islands. Air Europa's route network at its peak included over 60 destinations across Europe, Latin America, North America, and North Africa, served by a fleet of approximately 50 aircraft. The carrier also diversified its business model, launching Air Europa Express for regional services and developing partnerships with hotels and car rental companies that leveraged the broader Globalia Group's tourism expertise. Revenue peaked at over €2 billion annually, while the airline transported more than 12 million passengers per year, making it Spain's second-largest carrier and one of Europe's top 20 airlines by passenger volume. However, this expansion came at enormous financial cost, with the airline accumulating debt to finance aircraft purchases and route development, just as the global aviation market became increasingly competitive. The global financial crisis of 2008 exposed the vulnerabilities in Air Europa's growth strategy and marked the beginning of its decline. As leisure travel demand collapsed and business travel to Latin America dried up, the airline found itself over-leveraged and unable to adapt quickly to changing market conditions. Unlike larger carriers that could shift capacity between regions or rely on government support, Air Europa's focused strategy became a liability when its core markets suffered simultaneous downturns. The airline was forced to cut routes, delay aircraft deliveries, and reduce frequencies on its most profitable Latin American services. Competition intensified as low-cost carriers like Ryanair and EasyJet expanded aggressively in Europe, while established carriers like Lufthansa and Air France-KLM strengthened their own Latin American networks through partnerships and acquisitions. Air Europa's debt burden, estimated at over €1 billion by 2010, limited its ability to compete on price or invest in new aircraft, creating a vicious cycle of declining market share and reduced profitability. The Hidalgo family was forced to seek external investors, selling minority stakes to maintain liquidity while retaining control of the airline's operations. The rise of airline alliances and mega-carriers in the 2010s further marginalized Air Europa's position in the global aviation market. While the airline joined the SkyTeam Alliance in 2007, providing access to a worldwide network of partner carriers, it struggled to compete with the scale and resources of alliance leaders like Air France-KLM and Delta Airlines. The emergence of Gulf carriers Emirates, Etihad, and Qatar Airways also disrupted Air Europa's long-haul strategy, as these airlines offered superior aircraft, more frequent service, and competitive pricing on routes to Latin America via their Middle Eastern hubs. Air Europa's aging Airbus A330 fleet couldn't match the passenger appeal of Emirates' A380s or Qatar Airways' state-of-the-art A350s, while the airline lacked the financial resources to undertake a major fleet renewal. The carrier attempted to modernize by ordering Boeing 787 Dreamliners, but delivery delays and ongoing financial constraints prevented full implementation of this strategy. Meanwhile, Iberia, under new management following its merger with British Airways, began aggressively defending its Latin American routes with improved service and competitive pricing that Air Europa couldn't match. As the 2010s progressed, Air Europa found itself trapped between low-cost carriers on short-haul routes and better-funded competitors on long-haul services, a position that proved unsustainable for a family-owned business. The airline's passenger numbers stagnated around 11 million annually, while load factors declined as capacity growth outpaced demand. Air Europa attempted various strategic pivots, including increased focus on charter services, expansion of cargo operations, and partnerships with other carriers, but none generated sufficient revenue to offset the structural challenges facing the business. The COVID-19 pandemic delivered the final blow, destroying demand for international travel just as Air Europa was attempting to finalize a sale to IAG, the parent company of British Airways and Iberia. The deal, initially valued at €1 billion, was reduced to €500 million before ultimately collapsing in late 2021 as the pandemic's impact became clear. The Spanish government provided emergency support to keep the airline operational, but this assistance came with strict conditions that effectively ended the Hidalgo family's control over the carrier they had built from nothing. Air Europa's story illustrates both the possibilities and limitations of challenging established carriers in the modern aviation industry. For over 3 decades, the airline proved that superior service, strategic focus, and entrepreneurial management could create a successful alternative to bloated state-owned carriers. Air Europa's success in developing Spain's connections to Latin America created genuine value for passengers and helped strengthen economic ties between Spain and its former colonies. The airline's emphasis on operational excellence and customer service set standards that forced competitors like Iberia to improve their own offerings, ultimately benefiting all travelers. However, Air Europa's decline also demonstrates how the aviation industry's evolution toward massive scale, alliance partnerships, and access to global capital markets has made it nearly impossible for family-owned carriers to compete at the highest levels. The same focus and agility that enabled Air Europa's initial success became weaknesses when the market demanded the financial resources and operational scale that only giant airline groups could provide. Today, as Air Europa operates under government oversight while seeking new investors, its future remains uncertain, but its legacy as Spain's most successful private carrier and a pioneer of Spain-Latin America aviation connections is secure. The rise and fall of Air Europa serves as a reminder that in aviation, as in many industries, success often carries within it the seeds of its own destruction.